beginning, could you let me know your birthday because I want to know your
Yes.
age?
I was born in November 1932, which makes me 85 years old today. I was born in Manila, near Makati, at the Spanish hospital. And my mother was also born in Manila. My father was born in Scotland and came here with an English company. And they met here and they married here. I was the oldest of 4 children. We lived near the Paco Cemetery before the war. When the war started, it was decided that we should all go and live with my grandparents. My grandfather was very sick, and the night the Japanese army entered Manila on 2 January 1942, he was dying. So my father took the car and drove to get the doctor. On the way, he met a Japanese military outpost. They stopped him. He explained. So one soldier and one Japanese civilian came in the car with him. They went to pick up the doctor. They brought the doctor to my grandparents' house, and then they took the car and went away with the car. So we lost one car. That was the 2nd of January 1942. 3rd of January, the Japanese military came from house to house to see who should go into the prison camp. And my father was British, so he had to go. He was told to report 2 days later to Malate Church and to bring a small suitcase. We did not have to go because we were born in the Philippines, and the Japanese army considered that the people born in the Philippines were Filipinos. So we did not have to go to prison. And my grandfather died that day, and we continued to live there. My mother had 2 brothers that were in the army. Her older brother, Joseph McMicking, was a flyer, and he went to Corregidor. And when the battles got very bad, he was one of the officers that left Corregidor with General MacArthur. And he spent the war in Australia with General MacArthur's staff. My other uncle, Alfred, was with a lieutenant with the 51st Division Philippine Army, captured in Bataan and was in the Death March. And he stayed in the prison camp until the peace treaty between the Philippines and Japan in 1943, and then all the Filipino soldiers were released and he came home, very, very sick with malaria. During the war, we stayed at home and went to school. I went to a school called St. Paul's Convent, run by French nuns, until the 6th grade. After the 6th grade, only girls allowed. But during that 2 years, I went to school there, we had to learn Japanese. Our teachers were maybe 1 lesson or 2 lessons in advance of us. They didn't know Japanese either. So we were taught in the katakana. A, E, I, O, U, Ka, Ke, Ki, Ko, Ku, Cha, Che, Chi, all the katakana, which in 1955 was very useful for me because I was in the U.S. Army as a soldier in Korea, and I was able to read the signs in the underground in Tokyo to know where I was going. Everything, then after the 6th grade, my brother and I could no longer go to school with the nuns, so we were tutored at home by a professor of mathematics from University of Vienna, very, very nice man who taught us. He taught us all mathematics, history, geology, all the sciences, and his wife taught us English and French. And it was very happy school days, because when all the families raised animals during the war. We had pigs to eat the leftover food. And when we killed a pig, our lesson that day was to watch when the pig is open, and our professor showed us the heart, showed us how the lungs work, the intestines, the stomach. That was our lesson. Very interesting lessons. During the war, my father in Santo Tomas was given leave to come home, sometimes 3 days, sometimes 2 weeks. And he would go back, and they would give him again. Many people, he had a home to come to with us. Many Americans and British could not do that because they had no family in the Philippines. And if you are working for an American company and you have your money in an American bank, the bank is closed during the war, your American company does not pay you a salary, you cannot pay the rent, only you have to be inside the prison. 2 years ago, I went to an exhibition at Santo Tomas, and I was very impressed by maybe 14 or 15 letters written by people to the Japanese commandant begging to enter camp. Now, I have never seen letters where people beg to enter prison because it was so difficult for them outside. So for us, during the war years, more or less normal. Near our house, there was an apartment building with a large veranda around it, and my friends and I would go there in the evening and hide in the bushes to watch the geishas put their makeup on and get dressed, waiting for the officers. So we used to hide in the bushes and watch these beautiful women. Everything was more or less normal until probably the middle of 1944, when the first American carrier planes arrived and the bombing started. At that time, the Japanese soldiers became more strict. They started putting roadblocks on the roads. If you pass the roadblock, you have to stop and bow and to say the reason why you go. My house is over there, and they would let you pass. Little by little, the fighting became worse. On 20 January 1945, one day there was a big noise in our front garden. The gates opened, and maybe 25 Japanese soldiers with rifles and bayonets come walking towards the house. When they're approaching the house and we're standing and looking, we hear from the kitchen some noise, and the servants came with some more Japanese soldiers. They put us in one end of our porch, and probably spent 2 or 3 hours searching our house, opening everything, searching all the time. At the end of that time, they said, now we take you. And they tied the hands of all the men behind their back, and they were going to tie my grandmother, and she said, no, no, please. So they did not tie the hands of the women. They marched us in the street, surrounded by the soldiers, and they took us, I think it was Japanese Marines headquarters, which was in the Masonic Temple on Taft Avenue. And they took us there. By this time, it was maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And they kept us outside in the corner. And we waited there. People came from other houses also as prisoners. And at the end of the afternoon, the officer came out and started calling the names of the people. For our group, first they start with the servants' names, my brother's name, and then when we have our name called, we have to move. My name, and then my grandmother, and my grandmother starts to follow me, and they say, no, no, you go there. And so they divided our group, and they divided the other group in two. The servants and were all put together with my brother and me, and we were taken to the gates and released. And then we asked the next day, what can we do to feed our families? So for about 1 week, they allowed us to send food. And every day we packed and sent hot food. And then one day they say, no more food. By this time, it was probably around the end of this January, beginning of February. Things very, very difficult. On the 3rd of January, the Americans entered and liberated Santo Tomas. That's when things became very, very difficult. During those first days, we had one night, some bandits came to our house. They came to our house and they found many things to steal, automobile tires, etc. And they stayed all night, and at 5:30 in the morning, a bus came to take them with everything, and they disappeared. So a friend of my mother, who was married to a German, he went to the army headquarters, and the Japanese army provided a sentry at night. We had a sentry outside our house guarding us from the bandits. Very interesting, because Japanese army sentry guarding us, where our family with the Japanese Navy, prisoners. During this period, in the first week in February, there were much shelling, many fires everywhere. Our house survived because we had a very large garden. And although our garage on the edge of the property burned, our house did not burn. One day, there was the massacre at the St. Paul's convent. We could hear the explosions, and about half an hour later, people arrived at our house. They came over our wall. We had maybe 100, 150 people came to our house to stay in our house. All of us living underneath the house because the shelling is so bad. The shelling and the fires. Now, when I talk to school children, I say to them, you have to remember, no electricity, no telephone, no water, nothing. Your refrigerator, you cannot keep the food in the refrigerator. It was very difficult to eat in those days. Fortunately, my brother and I when we were playing, maybe 6 months earlier, we dug a well. So we had a well for water. The men in the house made that well deeper so we would have enough water for all of us. And we stayed in the house there, shelling all day, all night, fires starting, wondering what to do. And then on 15 February, which is 12 days after the Americans entered Manila, one man walks into the garden and his friend says, "What are you doing here? You're in North Manila." And he replied, "I'm with the American soldiers, they're close by." So I and a committee went to see the soldier. We said, "What do you suggest?" He said, "Well, tonight we're moving back, so I suggest you cross with us." So that's what we did. Everybody in the house, a long line, single line among the houses all destroyed, we crossed the lines. I remember that maybe 10 feet in front of me, a boy about 8 years of age was walking, and there was a bullet and a sniper shot him in the back and he fell down. And so we had to move away to go around it. It was not easy crossing because in some of these streets there was machine guns, and the Americans had to bring a tank to block the street so we could cross behind the tank. Everywhere there were snipers and machine guns crossing. That night we slept in the open. It was the most spectacular fireworks I've ever seen. All the explosions and the tracer bullets going every which way in the sky all night. And the next morning we start to build a small house from the ruins of the other houses. American Army came with lots of things of coffee and scrambled eggs. They fed all of the people that were waiting there. And then I saw this man who was a cousin of my mother, and I said, "Look at our new house." And he said, "Oh my goodness, your father is worried. Come, I take you to your father." So we had to go all the way around Manila, because all fighting in the middle, all the way around Manila, walking. Maybe sometimes army truck would give us a ride until we arrived in Santo Tomas prison, where we rejoined my father. We stayed in Santo Tomas 2 months. And then we returned to our house. My uncle had returned with MacArthur and he was on his staff. So we had a generator and we had a water tank. And we lived there until my father decided it was important for our education that we start school. Manila destroyed. So he sent us via Red Cross troop ship to San Francisco, train to New York, another ship to England, and then we took the train to Scotland to join my grandmother. And we lived there for 3 years, and then things were settling down over here, and my father asked if we wanted to return, and we said, well, yes, we want to go home. So I came back in 1948, and I graduated from high school here in 1950. Now, you were mentioning something, 1938. My father took us, all the family, my mother, the 4 children, and 2 Chinese amas, and we took a ship through the Suez Canal to Scotland. And we were going to stay there for 6 months. But my father became very worried after the Munich agreement between Hitler and Chamberlain Chamberlain came back to England with a piece of paper that says, "Peace in our time." My father thought it meant war, so he wants to go home. And then we left Scotland and we took the boat to New York, stayed there for 1 month, and then we took the train to Chicago, Vancouver, and I think it was the Empress of Japan to cross the Pacific to go back. Stopped in Yokohama on the way to Manila. I missed my